What if one hidden sin could keep a soul in purgatory far longer than most people imagine? For many Christians, purgatory is a mysterious reality. It is not hell, and it is not heaven, but a place of purification where souls destined for heaven are cleansed before entering the presence of God. The Church has long taught that nothing imperfect can stand before the fullness of divine holiness. Because of this, the soul must sometimes undergo a final purification after death. But according to the mystical revelations attributed to Saint Bridget of Sweden, there is something even more unsettling. In one of her visions, she described how certain sins carried during life can follow the soul into this purification and prolong its suffering there. Not because God desires punishment, but because the soul must be freed from everything that still binds it to sin. Saint Bridget spoke of a particular sin that many people commit almost without noticing. It is not always loud. It is not always visible. Yet in her vision, this sin had a profound effect on the soul after death, delaying its purification and keeping it longer in the fires of purgatory. In this video, we will explore the warning revealed through Saint Bridget's vision, the sin she described, and why it has such powerful spiritual consequences. Because the truth is that what we carry in our hearts during life does not disappear when life ends. And sometimes, the soul only realizes the weight of certain sins when it stands before eternity. To understand the warning contained in Saint Bridget's vision, we first need to understand what purgatory truly is. For many people today, the word itself sounds frightening or mysterious. Some imagine it as a place of punishment, while others think of it as a symbol rather than a spiritual reality. Yet in the tradition of the Catholic Church, purgatory has always been understood in a very specific way. It is not hell. The souls there are not condemned. Purgatory is the final purification of souls who have died in God's friendship, but who still carry the effects of sin. These souls are destined for heaven, but they must first be purified so that nothing imperfect remains within them. Scripture itself hints at this purification. In the first letter to the Corinthians, St. Paul speaks of a moment when a person's works will be tested by fire. The fire does not destroy the soul, but it reveals and purifies what is imperfect. This is the spiritual reality that many saints described in their visions. Saint Bridget was one of them. In her revelations, purgatory is not simply a place of suffering. It is a place where the soul becomes painfully aware of everything that separated it from God during life. Every attachment to sin, every unresolved fault, every hidden attitude of the heart must be purified before the soul can fully enter the light of heaven. And in one particular vision, Saint Bridget described something that deeply troubled those who heard it. She revealed that some souls remain in purgatory longer because of a sin many people carry through life without realizing its eternal consequences. If you believe the warnings of the saints still matter today, take a moment to like this video. It helps this message reach more people who are searching for answers about the soul and eternity. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next reflections about the visions and warnings left to us by the saints. Saint Bridget's vision becomes even more unsettling when she begins to describe the kind of sin that can prolong a soul's purification in purgatory. It is not always the sin people expect. Many imagine that only grave or scandalous sins would have consequences after death. But the saints often warned about something more subtle, the attitudes that grow quietly in the human heart and remain there for years. According to the revelations attributed to Saint Bridget, one of the sins that can weigh heavily on the soul is the refusal to forgive, resentment, bitterness, the quiet decision to hold on to an offense instead of releasing it. In daily life, this can seem small. People justify it easily. Someone hurt them, betrayed them, spoke against them, or treated them unfairly, and so they carry the wound in silence, sometimes for decades. Outwardly, life continues. They pray, work, care for their families, and follow their routines. Yet deep within the heart, a hidden resistance remains, a refusal to let go. In the spiritual tradition of the Church, forgiveness is not simply an emotional act. It is a decision that frees the soul. Christ himself warned about this when he taught his disciples to pray, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." Saint Bridget's vision reflects this same truth. She describes souls that loved God, but who arrived after death still carrying the weight of unresolved resentment. Because of this, their purification became longer and more painful, not because God lacked mercy, but because the soul could only enter heaven once it had learned to release what it refused to surrender during life. Let me ask you something important. Have you ever carried resentment towards someone for years, even while trying to live your faith? Many people struggle with this quietly. You can share your reflection in the comments. Your experience may help someone else who is facing the same struggle in their heart. In one of the visions attributed to Saint Bridget, she described a moment that reveals something deeply unsettling about the journey of the soul after death. She saw a soul undergoing purification, surrounded by a light that was both painful and purifying. The soul was not in despair because it knew it was destined for heaven, yet there was a deep sorrow within it, not the sorrow of condemnation, but the sorrow of realization. The soul suddenly understood how certain attitudes it had carried during life had followed it into eternity. Things that once seemed small or justified now appeared clearly before the light of divine truth. Saint Bridget described how the soul became painfully aware of every moment when it had chosen resentment instead of mercy, silence instead of reconciliation, pride instead of humility. What had once seemed like ordinary reactions during life now appeared as obstacles that had to be purified. This is one of the most striking elements of the vision. The suffering of the soul was not only the purification itself, but the clarity with which it now saw its own past. The soul realized that many of these wounds could have been healed during life. Forgiveness could have been given. Peace could have been restored. But those moments had been postponed, ignored, or buried under pride. And now, in the purifying fire of God's justice and mercy, the soul had to release everything it had refused to surrender while still on earth. It was this purification that prolonged its stay in purgatory, a purification that, according to Saint Bridget's vision, could have been much shorter if the heart had chosen forgiveness during life. Saint Bridget's vision helps us understand something profound about the nature of the soul and the justice of God. The reason this sin prolongs the soul's purification is not simply because it was committed during life. The deeper reason is that resentment and refusal to forgive attach themselves to the heart in a very subtle way. They become part of a person's inner disposition. When a person carries resentment for years, the heart slowly becomes accustomed to it. What once felt like pain begins to feel justified. The mind repeats the offense again and again, strengthening the wound instead of healing it. From a human perspective, this can seem understandable. People believe they have been wronged. They feel that letting go would mean accepting injustice or forgetting what happened. But in the light of eternity, the soul sees things differently. Saint Bridget's vision shows that when the soul stands before God, it suddenly understands that forgiveness was never about denying the pain. It was about freeing the heart from being chained to that pain. Every resentment that was kept alive during life becomes something the soul must release during purification. And letting go after death is far more difficult than it would have been during life. This is why the saints constantly spoke about forgiveness as an act of spiritual freedom. It is not only a gift offered to others, it is a liberation for the soul itself. Saint Bridget's warning reminds us that the things we refuse to release in this life may become the very things the soul must painfully surrender in purgatory. Saint Bridget's vision does not stop at explaining the sin itself. It also reveals what happens to the soul when it carries that unresolved weight into eternity. In the purification of purgatory, the soul begins to see with a clarity it never had during life. On earth, emotions, pride, and wounded memories often cloud a person's judgment. A person can convince themselves that their anger is justified or that holding on to resentment is normal, but in the light of God's truth, that illusion disappears. Saint Bridget describes how the soul suddenly recognizes how much peace it lost during life by refusing to forgive. The resentment that once felt protective now appears as a heavy chain that kept the heart from loving freely. This realization itself becomes part of the purification. The soul understands that every moment of bitterness, every silent grudge, every refusal to reconcile left a mark on its spiritual life. These marks must now be purified before the soul can fully enter the joy of heaven. And yet, even in this suffering, there is hope. The soul in purgatory does not suffer in despair. It suffers with certainty. It knows that its purification will end and that one day it will see God face to face. But the longing for that moment becomes intense. Saint Bridget's vision shows a soul that desires heaven more than anything, yet must wait until every attachment to resentment and pride has been completely removed. Only then can the soul finally enter the peace it longed for during life. One of the most consoling truths in the Christian tradition is that the souls in purgatory are not alone. According to the teaching of the Church and the reflections of many saints, the faithful on earth can help them. Through prayer, sacrifice, and acts of charity, believers can intercede for the souls who are undergoing purification. Saint Bridget often emphasized this spiritual connection between the living and the departed. In her revelations, prayer for the souls in purgatory is presented not only as an act of compassion, but also as a powerful expression of Christian love. When someone prays for the dead, they are asking God to shorten the time of purification and to bring that soul closer to the joy of heaven. For centuries, Christians have offered masses, prayers, and acts of mercy with this intention. The belief behind this practice is simple but profound. The communion of saints unites the Church on earth with the souls who are still being purified. In this way, no soul walks the path of purification alone. The prayers of the faithful become a source of relief, a spiritual assistance offered with love and hope. Many devotional traditions connected to Saint Bridget also include prayers for the souls in purgatory. One of the best known is the Pieta Prayer Book, which contains reflections and prayers that have inspired countless believers to remember the suffering souls and ask God to hasten their purification. These prayers remind us that while the souls in purgatory cannot help themselves, they can be helped by the love and faith of those who still walk on earth. Do you usually pray for the souls in purgatory? Many Christians forget this powerful act of charity. If this is something you practice, or if this video reminded you of its importance, share it in the comments. Your testimony can inspire others to remember the suffering souls in their prayers. At first glance, Saint Bridget's vision may sound severe. The idea that a soul must undergo purification after death can feel unsettling, especially when we think about how easily human beings hold on to wounds and resentments during life. But the deeper message behind purgatory is not punishment, it is mercy. According to the spiritual tradition of the Church, purgatory exists because God desires the salvation of souls. Heaven is a place of perfect union with God, a place where nothing impure can remain. For this reason, the soul must be completely purified before entering that eternal joy. Saint Bridget's visions often emphasize this reality. The suffering experienced in purgatory is not meaningless suffering. It is a process that frees the soul from every attachment that once separated it from divine love. In life, people often struggle to release their pride, their resentments, or the wounds they carry in their hearts. These attachments can remain hidden, even within people who sincerely love God. Purgatory becomes the place where those final obstacles are removed. The fire described by many saints is not a fire of destruction. It is a fire of purification. It burns away what prevents the soul from fully loving God and fully receiving His presence. In this sense, purgatory is not a sign of God's severity, but of His compassion. Without this purification, many souls who long for heaven would still be bound by the imperfections of their earthly lives. Saint Bridget's vision reminds us that God does not abandon these souls. He prepares them, patiently and mercifully, for the moment when they will finally enter the light of heaven. Saint Bridget's warning is not meant to leave us with fear. Its true purpose is to invite reflection and change while there is still time. One of the most powerful lessons in her vision is that the purification experienced in purgatory often involves things that could have been resolved during life. Many of the burdens carried by the soul after death are the same ones that weighed on the heart while the person was still alive. Resentment, pride, the refusal to forgive. These are not only spiritual problems. They are wounds that quietly shape the way people live, think, and relate to others. Over time, they become habits of the heart. This is why the saints constantly spoke about the importance of forgiveness and humility. They understood that every act of mercy during life frees the soul from something that might otherwise need purification later. Forgiving someone who caused pain is never easy. It often requires courage, patience, and sometimes even prayer to soften the heart. Yet every step toward forgiveness breaks a chain that resentment tries to place on the soul. Saint Bridget's vision reminds us that heaven is not only a destination reached after death. It begins in the transformation of the heart during life. Every time a person chooses reconciliation instead of resentment, humility instead of pride, and mercy instead of bitterness, something inside the soul becomes lighter, and that lightness is not lost. It is carried beyond death. Because the soul that learns to forgive in this life will have far less to release in the purification that comes after. At the heart of Saint Bridget's vision, there is a lesson that reaches far beyond purgatory itself. It is a lesson about the state of the human heart. Many people spend their lives focused on outward actions alone. They avoid certain visible sins, fulfill religious duties, and try to remain faithful in what others can see. Yet Saint Bridget's warning reminds us that God also looks at what is hidden within us. He sees the silent resentments, the pride that refuses to bend, the wounds we keep feeding in secret, and the mercy we withhold when we feel justified. This is what makes her vision so powerful. It is not only a message about what happens after death. It is a mirror held up to the soul while life is still unfolding. Saint Bridget teaches us that spiritual preparation for eternity does not begin in the final hour. It begins now, in the daily choices of the heart. It begins when a person decides to release bitterness, to seek peace, to stop carrying old wounds as if they were treasures, and to let grace enter the places that pride tries to protect. The soul is shaped little by little. Every act of forgiveness purifies it. Every act of humility softens it. Every act of mercy prepares it for the presence of God. This is the deeper meaning of Saint Bridget's warning. What we carry inside us today becomes part of what we will bring before eternity. And for that reason, the wisest soul is not the one that waits to be purified later, but the one that begins to be purified now, while God is still offering time, grace, and the chance to change. Saint Bridget's vision ultimately leaves us with a warning that is both sobering and hopeful. Sobering because it reminds us that nothing hidden in the human heart escapes the light of eternity. The resentments we nurture, the pride we protect, and the forgiveness we refuse are not forgotten when life ends. They remain attached to the soul until they are finally purified. But the message is also filled with hope, because the time to change is now. Saint Bridget's revelation does not exist to frighten the faithful, but to awaken them. It reminds us that every moment of life is an opportunity to free the soul from the burdens it carries. Every act of mercy shortens the chains that could otherwise bind the soul after death. The saints constantly spoke about this truth. The purification of the soul does not have to begin only in purgatory. It can begin here, in the quiet decisions of everyday life. When someone chooses forgiveness instead of resentment, something within the soul becomes lighter. When pride gives way to humility, the heart opens to grace. When mercy replaces bitterness, the soul moves closer to the freedom it was created for. Saint Bridget's warning invites us to look honestly at our own hearts. Is there someone we still refuse to forgive? Is there a wound we continue to carry, even though it poisons our peace? These are not small questions, because what we carry in our hearts today may shape the purification of our souls tomorrow. Saint Bridget's vision leaves us with a powerful reminder about the journey of the soul. Many people spend their lives worrying about things that will one day disappear: possessions, reputation, temporary conflicts, and the opinions of others. Yet the saints constantly remind us that the only thing that truly follows us beyond death is the state of our soul. The attitudes we nurture in our hearts today do not simply vanish when life ends. They shape the way the soul approaches eternity. Saint Bridget's warning about the sin that can prolong a soul's purification is not meant to frighten us. It is meant to awaken us. It invites us to look honestly at the hidden places of our hearts, the wounds we refuse to release, and the forgiveness we postpone. Because every act of mercy in this life becomes a step toward freedom for the soul. Every time a person chooses forgiveness instead of resentment, humility instead of pride, and peace instead of bitterness, something within the soul is purified even before death arrives. And perhaps that is the deepest message of this vision. The purification of the soul does not have to begin only in purgatory. It can begin here and now, in the quiet decisions we make each day. So take a moment to reflect. Is there someone you still need to forgive? If this reflection touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. I read the comments and try to respond to many of them. If this message helped you reflect about your own spiritual life, take a moment to like this video so more people can discover it. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next reflections about the warnings and visions of the saints. Your support helps this message reach more souls. Thank you for being here. And I will see you in the next reflection. God bless you.